Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about Chapter 4 in the textbook, Social Cognition, or how we think about the ways that people and situations interact. The human brain is an amazing instrument. It can do more complex activities and is more flexible than perhaps any other system on Earth. However, it is subject to a number of inaccurate errors, biases, and cognitive mistakes. In order to make accurate judgments and decisions, we first need accurate information. However, we don't let that stop us. Research shows that the average person makes a decision about other people's personality, behavior, and other attributes in less than a second. We call this a snap judgment, and it's based on very thin slices of information. One example of this is a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance. When we see a large group of people behaving in a particular way, we tend to assume that their behavior reflects their underlying attitudes and beliefs. In fact, this can sometimes be wrong. For example, in many authoritarian countries, criticizing the leadership is a very dangerous activity. And so when we see large groups of people supporting the leader, singing his or her praises, we often mistakenly assume that they actually do support the leader, when in fact they may just be acting out of fear of negative consequences if their true feelings were known. Another example is the self-fulfilling prophecy, where people act in particular ways that bring about the very thing that they expect to happen. For example, if you assume you're going to lose a game and you don't play very well or very hard, it's likely that you will in fact lose that game. Another way that we get inaccurate information is through secondhand sources who are not always entirely accurate. For example, many people would like to convince us to support their particular ideological position. To do so, they may present only a small bit of information about the idea or objective, and this information is disproportionately supporting their particular position. We'll come back to more examples of this in a bit. There's an old saying in the news business that goes like this: if it bleeds, it leads. What that means is examples of disasters or harm to people are more likely to receive coverage than feel-good, positive stories. In fact, decades of research have shown that people who watch more television news tend to see the world as more dangerous than people who watch less news. This may reflect the fact that they see a disproportionate amount of bad news. If you really want to see how the presentation of information can manipulate behavior, you need only look at advertising. The goal of marketing is to get you to purchase something that you would otherwise not purchase, or to purchase something in place of something else that you would have purchased. And so the entire goal of marketing and advertising is to get you to do things that you would not otherwise do. It is unlikely that corporations would spend trillions of dollars every year if this didn't work. If a series of information is presented, we tend to remember more that at the beginning of the series and that at the end of the series. These effects are referred to respectively as the primacy effect and the recency effect. You may remember this from your Psychology 150 general psychology class. Besides the order of information that's presented, the way the information is framed or spun has an influence on whether we perceive that position as accurate, favorable, or inaccurate, unfavorable. For example, the inheritance tax or estate tax received wide support in polls of American voters. However, the same policy, framed as a death tax, received very little support. Just changing one word in the description of the exact same policy can flip the amount of support for that policy in the voting public. One of the most ubiquitous, powerful, and unconscious biases is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency we have to pay more attention to and seek out information which confirms our pre-existing beliefs, and to ignore or challenge information which tends to disconfirm the pre-existing belief. If you are feeding yourself a steady diet of information that only confirms what you already believe, you are unlikely to change that belief. This is, of course, the antithesis of the scientific method. Sometimes confirmation bias is not even unconscious. When we do this on purpose, it's referred to as motivated confirmation bias. Schemas are cognitive structures that organize information in a way that allows us to put things into categories. We have a schema for chairs. We have a schema for justice. We have a schema for Apple. So all of the information that we encounter in the world is placed into either an existing category, or if we have to create a new one, we do so and place the information into a brand new category. Schemas influence what we pay attention to. For example, in the very famous gorilla costume study, people were asked to watch 5 individuals pass a basketball and count the number of passes. While viewing this, a man in a gorilla costume walked behind the players. Afterwards, only half of people remembered seeing the gorilla walk across the basketball court. Gorilla suits do not fit into our schema of a basketball game. Humans have 2 basic ways of processing information about the outside world: the intuitive system and the rational system. We use the intuitive system most of the time. We make very rapid assumptions and responses based on information that comes rapidly to mind. In fact, we can carry out multiple assessments intuitively at the same time. The rational or controlled system requires deliberative deduction based on logic and rules of thought. We can only pay attention to one object or item using this system at a time. That is, we cannot focus deliberatively on more than one thing. So when people say they're multitasking, they are largely switching back and forth between 2 conscious tasks rather than doing them at the same time, because we don't have the underlying brain structures to consciously attend to 2 items simultaneously. Heuristics, or rules of thumb, are rules that we use to make judgments very rapidly based on an assumption about how things generally work. One of these is the availability heuristic, in which we judge how frequent something is, how likely it is to occur, based on how easily we can think of an example. The classic example is that people tend to overestimate their likelihood of dying in an airplane crash because every time there's an airplane crash anywhere in the world, it makes the news. On the other hand, we tend to underestimate the likelihood of dying in a car crash in the same trip because we don't hear about every single car crash that occurs everywhere in the world every day. A similar phenomenon is referred to as fluency, which is the ease or difficulty associated with processing information in a particular task. For example, some words are easier to think about and to process than other words. Words with which we are familiar are typically easier to process than unfamiliar words. Another heuristic, or rule of thumb, is the representativeness heuristic, which is a shortcut we use to classify something by how similar it is to the typical case. Unfortunately, doing this causes us to discount base rate information, which is information about the relative frequency of events in different categories in a particular population of interest. Let's look at an example. Page 130 in your textbook describes the Tom W. study. Let me read you the prompt from this study. Participants were read this story about Tom W. Tom W. is of high intelligence, although lacking in true creativity. He has a need for order and clarity and for neat and tidy systems in which every detail finds its appropriate place. His writing is rather dull and mechanical, occasionally enlivened by somewhat corny puns and by flashes of imagination of the sci-fi type. He has a strong drive for competence. He seems to have little feel and little sympathy for other people and does not enjoy interacting with others. Self-centered, he nonetheless has a deep moral sense. The participants were then told that Tom was in graduate school and were divided into 3 groups. One group ranked 9 academic disciplines in terms of the likelihood that Tom chose them as his field. Second group ranked the 9 disciplines in terms of how similar they thought Tom was to the typical student in each discipline. Again, how representative was Tom of the typical student in each of these disciplines. The third group did not see the description of Tom. They simply estimated what percentage of graduate students in the United States were enrolled in each of the 9 disciplines. Let's look at the results. As you can see from table 4.2, there's a great deal of overlap between the first 2 groups. The 2 groups rated Tom almost identically. One group, the first group, rated Tom in terms of how likely he was to major in that particular field. The second group in terms of how similar or representative he was of students in that field. In essence, both groups rated Tom based on how typical or representative he was of students in that particular field of study. However, if you look at the third group, you'll notice that the ratings are very different than the first 2 groups. Computer science, which both the first 2 groups thought was most representative of Tom's aptitudes and interests, is near the bottom in terms of the frequency with which students enroll in that major. Ignoring the percentage of students who actually enroll in a particular major biases our estimation of which major Tom actually chose. I hope you've enjoyed my review of Chapter 4, and I look forward to talking to you next week.